Okay. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for coming. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, of course. What I'm going to talk about is some work that I've been doing with colleagues, an international group of scientists. So although it's just my name up there, there's actually about 20 scientists and government people from Canada, from Australia, working on this project. I'm going to try and mix methodology with a little bit of content. So quite a lot of what I'm talking about is method of how people make sense and how we make sense of how people make sense. And I'm just going to use some of the data that we've collected in a survey to illustrate some of the points. So it's very much about method with a smattering of content. How many of you recognize that photograph? Concordia. In theory, it's got nothing to do with climate change. We shall see. I'm going to ask you to read those two statements, and then I'm going to ask you to give me a show of hands of how many of you agree with the first statement. Sorry, the first statement is the captain of the Concordia was a rascal and should have gone down with the ship. Or the second statement, the captain of the Concordia did the very best he could under the circumstances. So the one is he's a rascal, should have gone down with the ship. Two, did the best he could under tough circumstances. Who of you agree with the first statement?
The first part of the verse.
Might be a bit harsh. So he was a rascal. So just show again, please. And who the second? Much smaller group. So what interests me in, well, maybe just a final show of hands. Who was there? So part of...
I think you have to explain what is Concordia.
The Concordia was that cruise ship that sank in the Mediterranean a few weeks ago, a month ago, off Italy. Okay? What intrigues me a little bit about sense-making is what we've just done, is that despite none of you being there, you were able, A, to make a decision, and B, to act on that decision. You were able to pass judgment on the captain from, I don't know what information. So you made a judgment call, and a lot of what we do as society is we make sense of situations based on similar kind of processes. Where did you get your information from? You weren't there. How did you come to make that judgment call about the captain of the Concordia? So a lot of what I'm going to talk about is similar kind of processes, but in relation to climate change. I'm going to try and talk very briefly about sense-making itself, what it is. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we collected data, what we did. I'm going to then try and make sense of the survey. And this is always problematic, and I'll try and explain to you why and how it's problematic. And then I'll try and look at some of the insights, some of the blind spots, and some of the implications of what we've done. Sense-making helps us reduce complexity and create order. We cannot act without first making sense, right? You need to make sense of the world in order to orient yourself towards how you're going to act in the world. Sense-making gives rise to frames and framing. How you frame things is part of your sense-making process. You can construct things as an environmental problem, climate change problem, and how you frame that brings along with it a whole bunch of conceptual ideas that enables you to make sense of the world. It's a social and interactive process. I doubt many of you came up with your judgments about the captain of the Concordia single-handedly. You've been reading the media, you've been reading blogs, you've been maybe talking to colleagues. It's a social process that we go through, and the output is a social construct. And again, it's a precursor to action. And I just want us to reflect on, again, the captain of the Concordia and how you reached your decision. You are happy to pass judgment on the captain. Guilty. Should have gone down with the ship, maybe. And that's in fact an action. You are prepared to take action on your sense making based on information that we don't know where it came from. I need to just point out that there's two things that I'm going to be trying to talk about, which is a kind of dual process theory of cognition, that we have a fast, frugal, intuitive, common sense processing pathway, if you like, and then a more rational, slow, thought out, and cognitively expensive pathway. It's well documented in the psychology literature. I'm going to be referring a little bit to that, so I just wanted to highlight that. So the fast, frugal is common sense, what we just do on the spur of the moment. And Argyris and Sean talk about theories in use, and I suspect, but I've got no evidence, that our common sense is how you respond in a given situation. The rational one is the logical discourse. When you're having a logical discussion with somebody, it's this rational narrative. And that may be what Argyris and Sean call espoused theory. So that if you ask somebody how does something work, they tell you this, but when they actually come to act, they may well be acting on that fast common sense model. Just to highlight for you that what we're talking about in relation to climate change is social change in order to adapt. For social change to occur, you require coordinated collective action. Me, Tim Lynam, acting by himself in the middle of nowhere is not going to change anything. I recognize three mechanisms for achieving coordinated collective action. Markets, the invisible hand of Adam Smith, regulations, governance systems, and beliefs or culture. And it's really this last one that I'm dealing with in this work. Another important conceptual framework is the Pin Effin Framework from David Snowden and Company. It talks about knowledge domains. The simple domain on the bottom, your bottom right there, cause-effect relationships are known. And so you can use engineering principles, you know exactly what the stresses are, it's quite clear. Complicated, cause-effect relationships are separated in time and space, and there's often lags. So I've got a catchment image on the screen there. If you change some land use in the upper part of the catchment, it may take weeks or years or decades before you see stuff happening at the bottom end. You need expert opinion. Complex domain, sorry, this is an image that may not have that much meaning to you, but it's Julia Gillard is the woman and Kevin Rudd is the man, and that's the former and current leaders of Australia. And Julia Gillard overthrew Kevin Rudd in a quite remarkable coup within the party. And in the complex domain, which is this one, cause-effect relationships are seldom discernible except retrospectively. And they need not repeat themselves. They seldom repeat themselves. The last one is chaos, and I use that image from the not so long ago riots in the UK, just no cause-effect relationships. The right-hand side of this is called the ordered domain. There's order. You can know the cause-effect relationships. The left-hand side is the unordered domain. You do not know the cause-effect relationships. And what's really important, so a lot of the work that I'm talking about is in that top left, in the complex domain. So the way people, society arrives at meaning is a complex phenomena. You cannot necessarily predict how it's going to happen, how it's going to emerge, or the causality. And if you do identify causality, it may not be the same next time. So that kiss of Kevin Rudd's and Julia Gillard's, there's lots of images of them kissing. One is like a Judas kiss. She's betrayed Kevin Rudd. Another is a make-up kiss. we're all together again, we love each other, and we're working together for the future of Australia. Very, very different causality, very, very different messages. So just remembering that I'm working in that complex domain, and that's the domain of human meaning, where people make sense. The survey that we ran, we used a software package called SenseMaker, which is a product from Cognitive Edge, David Snowden's company. And basically the survey, you present people with a familiar situation. Imagine you're in a lift and there's a couple of people discussing adaptation to climate change. One says it's too hard, the other one says, no, I know lots of examples of stuff going on. They turn to you and say, what do you think? And then we get people to enter a narrative into an online survey instrument in response to that situation. So it's a situated process, and roughly that's the numbers of responses we've got. So just over 900 narratives from people, largely in Australia, but about a couple of hundred in Canada as well. And we broke it down by scientists, academics, government, public, general. Quick overview of the instrument. We have a free listing task, which is a word association task. Please write down the first words that come to mind when you think of climate change. Please write the first words that you think about when you think of what helps adapt to climate change. And what that's after is, remember that fast, intuitive, common sense belief set, or after that, that's what we're trying to get at. Second part is a narrative setting, which I've already explained to you. You give them a situation and ask them to tell you of their experiences in relation to that. That is the slow cognitive thing. The moderators, we get the respondent to interpret their narrative, right? So they've told us a story, we get them to interpret their story, to make meaning from their story using these moderators. General research questions, we could then ask them about their behavior, what they did, how many times they did it, etc. In this survey, we didn't ask any of those questions. And then lastly, we have standard socio-demographic measures, age, gender, where you live, what you do, okay? So it's just important to reflect on this, because this is a very, very different approach to any kind of normal questionnaire survey. It's fundamentally different. We can analyze this around the speaker. Who's talking? Who's responding to the questionnaire? Where do they live? What do they do? Their age, their gender, and so on. We can analyze what they said. What's in their narrative? What's in their word associations? Deeply held beliefs in the word associations, more everyday discourse in the narrative. And their meaning. We can analyze how they interpret their own narrative. So we get them to interpret their narrative in the instrument, which is different to the way people do content analysis, where we, the researcher, will analyze their narrative. And we get them to talk about their emotions, why they told us that story, what was their motivation, who was in the narrative that they were giving, and that kind of thing. So then we can look at the interactions. It starts giving us the ability to look at, are particular groups saying particular things? Is there a group bias? Is one group using a particular interpretive frame or not? Are the things people say consistent with their interpretation of what they say? Is there a consistency between the fast, common sense and the slow? So I'm first going to present some results around what they said. I'm not going to present very much at all around the speaker. I'll present a little bit first of what they said, and then I'll present some meaning stuff. Firstly, how people were defining and contextualizing climate change. So we asked them, this is word association, fast, common sense. What are the first words that come to mind when you think of climate change? And in various of these data sets, I'm not presenting the whole data set, I'm presenting subsets just to highlight and illustrate particular points. This is a correspondence analysis plot, which is similar to a principal components analysis. It's based on the similarity of the language that's being used. So this is looking at the language people used in their word association tasks. And the little percentage things up at the top there, 23%, that means this axis explains 23% of the variance. This axis, 77% of the variance in the data set. So in all, we're kind of over 90%, so it's a pretty good explanation. And what these numbers are is this one is Australia, the centroid of Australian responses. This 2 is Canadian responses, and this 3 is other countries. This is a subset of the data, 630 responses, and it's our most recent survey. So we replicated the survey a couple of different times. And really what I'd like you to just notice is that there's quite different language in the 2 different countries. So what people are anchoring it to, what are the things, the concepts that people are anchoring climate change to are different. In Canada, they're talking about flooding, sea level rise, polar ice caps, adaptation, and in Australia, carbon tax, and so on. So the way people are framing climate change is quite different across those countries. Notice the shared meaning. So in social representations theory, one might think of this as the core of the emerging social representation around climate change. They share things around loss, environment, and the earth. So both groups share that, and then these more peripheral components that are country-specific. This is the narrative. So that first one, that one is the word association, the fast common sense one. This is the narrative. Same kind of data, same kind of a plot. 80% of the variance on this axis, 20%. So the countries more or less captures most of the data in this plot, most of the variance. And again, what they share, people, environment, long-term. This is a long-term issue, a long-term problem. But again, quite different languages from the narratives around Canada dealing with adaptation, with impacts, and with the public. And in Australia, carbon reduction, individuals and business. So you're starting to get out different responsible agencies that are linked to climate change. We looked at respondent roles. So each of the respondents, we got them to identify themselves as government employees, general public, rural residents, urban resident scientists, other community people we don't know. A weaker data set in terms of the explanatory power of the plot, but very interesting in terms of government and scientists on this side, dealing with flooding and impacts, and the public on that side, completely different construction of climate change. Okay? What do practitioners or the public think are the main barriers or enablers of adaptation? Similar kind of plots, word association data, Canada to the right, Australia to the left. So all that's doing is it's smearing the difference across these 2 dimensions, and Canadian responses are largely there. It's not universal. Australian responses largely there. This is word association. What helps adaptation? And Canada, planning and awareness. Australia, technology. So things like solar power, green fuels, reducing carbon emissions. So quite different things people are relating to in terms of what enables them to adapt. And again, this common set in the middle, knowledge, information, understanding. Knowledge, information, and understanding helps them. And I want you to remember that because I'll show some contradictory evidence a bit later. What hinders adaptation? In Canada, a lack of resources, poor leadership or lack of leadership, and vested interests. In Australia, costs and politics. So quite different explanations about what enables and what hinders adaptation. Common thing, greed and ignorance. Fancy that. A slightly different perspective on similar data, so it's just to give you a different way of looking at it, the way that we're looking at it. This is a heat map, and the brighter the color, so red is a high frequency of that term use, dark blue is almost none. What's going on the top here is we've combined countries, which is the first number. 1 is Australia, 2 is Canada, and then whether they're government people or rural people would be the second number. So we've got clustering at the top here, and I've drawn white lines to show the dominant clusters. And we're clustering the language on the left-hand side here in a similar way. I don't want you to get too concerned with the details of the figure, is just look at the patterns, right? Very common language in this group here. For both countries, there's Australian, urban dwellers, scientists, and other, I think, from Canada, so Canadian and Australian. But notice here, this group, largely Australians, very different language to this group here. So we can start mapping what is the language that different groups are using in relation to climate change and what helps them. And that can start helping us communicate with them, understand how they're framing the problems, and then start engaging with them. So it's looking at patterns in language use that can inform how we act in relation to them. I'm going to change gear a little bit. What I was just presenting is what they said, and now I'm going to present just a very quick kind of few images on their interpretation. So remember, we've got the respondents to tell us a story, and then we've given them a bunch of measures and we've asked them to interpret their story. That's what I'm going to talk about. This is a Polarity Dashboard. Can you read the writing at the back? Too small? Some can, some need glasses, some don't. More or less, this is a frequency distribution across what we call polarities. And we use a polarity, which is an ideal state in the middle. This is the ideal state. Going to two extremes on either side. An absence of and an excess of. So we get people to interpret their narrative. And what we've got here is their network relationships. They're completely isolated to connected to everybody. Their empowerment, they feel unable to make a difference, overwhelmed with opportunities to make a difference. They're constrained by ill-defined plans, inflexible plans. Their narratives reflected a sense of powerlessness or being overly controlled. There was denial, urgency, not enough information, too much information or overwhelming information, and things are always the same and things are constantly changing. What I'd like you to notice, and we put these in sort of rank order of how far they deviate from the ideal state. So at the top, people are close to the ideal state. So most people are kind of reasonably well connected with networks. Down the bottom, stability, people saying things are always the same, they're not changing. So what we can start looking at is patterns in how people interpret their narratives of what's going on to them in climate change. And remember I mentioned pay attention to that knowledge information thing, which was the cluster in the middle. Notice that in terms of information, people are overwhelmed with information. So the predominant response was, there's too much information, it's too hard, we actually don't know what to do. This is a triad that we use, where we force people to make trade-offs between, to what extent did the following play a role in their narrative, information, goals, and beliefs. And what the data shows are clusterings, where each dot represents somebody's narrative. So there's a narrative behind there, we can dig into it and we can look at the narrative, we can look at what they say. And there's this cluster which is predominantly information. They say information was the important thing enabling us to adapt. this group saying it's everything, and then this group is saying it's all beliefs, it's the way people believe things. So we can start unpacking and understanding which groups, which social groups, which entities have those different things emerging for them, and that starts giving us avenues to start interacting with them and unblocking, if you like, behaviors to enhance adaptation. Again, just going through, we had a measure in the survey around, are people getting ready for change, trying to prevent change, are they changing, are they recovering from change? So just trying to understand where were they in their adaptation, were they changing or not? And these are just some of the variables. Information not available, they're feeling that they're unable to make a difference, people feel powerless, and they are isolated. And this is just a correlation, so the grey, they're all positive correlations, they're positively correlated, and it's a relatively weak correlation of about 0.4. So what this is saying is that people that felt unable to make a difference generally felt powerless. People that were powerless generally felt isolated in their narratives. So in their narratives they were saying, we are isolated and we're powerless. So this is the general public that were getting ready for change. This is the government getting ready for change. So different relationships, suddenly the government is talking about, it's a very weak correlation, but there's not enough information. So it's just same kind of data, but a different perspective. One's from the general public, this is the general public stories, these are the government stories, and these are the academic stories. So academics feeling, or scientists feeling strongly isolated and unable to make a difference, powerless. Again, I'm changing perspective now. We've coded the narratives that we got according to the Pin Effin Framework. Each story was coded, or each narrative was coded by 2 independent researchers to check, and each narrative was coded as reflecting either a simple, a complicated, a complex, or a chaotic worldview. So that they devised some rules saying that if, for example, people said, it's in the hands of the gods, no idea, that was coded as a chaotic, uncontrollable, nothing we can do. So we coded each of the narratives into those worldviews, and on the right-hand side, the ordered, on the left-hand side, the unordered worldviews. Then using chi-squared analysis, I'm not presenting any of the statistics here. Everything is statistically significant to 0.05. We use z-score, so it's a chi-square for the table, and then a z-score to see whether each of these elements makes a significant contribution to the overall chi-square. So the chi-squares are all significant. The z-scores are significant unless I put a question mark around them. So, first thing, the worldviews appear to orient people towards different solutions to adaptation. People with a simple worldview have identified technology as their solution. Complicated worldviews choose money, predominantly, it's not exclusively, of course. Complex worldview, regulation, which is a bit odd, it's counterintuitive, and the chaotic money. Really fascinating for me, who were they talking about? So we got people to identify who they were, and we also got them to identify, using the same scale, who's in the narrative. So, people with a simple worldview, in blue is who they were talking about, and in red is who they were not talking about. So simple worldview people spoke of the general public, did not mention civil society. Complex worldview people spoke about civil society, did not mention the general public. So we can start looking at who is in the frame of reference for different groups. And interesting that the reverse of complicated and chaotic, science is in the narrative, civil society and government not. Government is in the narrative, science is not. What motivated people to talk? The ordered domain people were negatively motivated. They were going to complain, they were going to criticize, they were going to argue. The unordered were more positive. That one's got a question mark, not significant, up at the top left there. They were to encourage, to congratulate, those kind of terms. So quite different motivational orientations. What were they doing? So were they changing? Were they trying to prevent change? Were they doing nothing? The simple and complicated tended to be doing nothing. They were in denial. And the complex and chaotic people were changing or preparing to change. So quite different action orientations depending on the worldview. So, some of the things that we've discovered and the blind spots of what we're talking about. Multiple perspectives are great. I think we all want a multiple perspective. Well, let me backtrack. If you accept the Pin Effin complex domain, cause-effect relationships are seldom discernible except retrospectively, and they don't repeat themselves. Science as we know it doesn't operate in that domain. Science hypotheses, models rely on stable cause-effect relationships. So science works in the ordered domains, right? As soon as you're in the unordered domain, you can't build a model because the next time you come around, it's redundant. So that what we need in there is a multiple perspective, that we've got to make sense of these multiple perspectives. But that means there's much more uncertainty around causality and around the relationships between things, between people, between outcomes and stimuli. It's very discomforting. Scientists don't like it. We don't have a rule of practice in the unordered domain for the most part, the biophysical scientists. And in fact, I think you cross a boundary. There's a threshold between the ordered and the unordered domain, between the biophysical scientists where their epistemology is around knowable cause-effect relationships, and a multiple perspective side on the unordered domain. There's an epistemological bifurcation, if you like, which is really tough. Policy. I was in Canada recently, and the Canadian government partnered with us on this survey, and when I was presenting the results and discussing with them, the woman that I was meeting with said, usually what we do is when we've got a problem, we hire a consultant, they give us an answer and we formulate policy. It's clear. They didn't want to get involved in looking at the data and seeing these multiple perspectives. It's too hard. It's discomforting. Vested interests. There's vested interest in maintaining the particular belief structures that we see in the world, and they want to keep them that way. So it's very discomforting for them when we start saying we need multiple perspectives. And it's clearly quite difficult to lead a multiple perspectives world. However, there's good news. Multiple perspectives provide us with the ability to identify groups based on their experiences. So groups that are having different experiences, that we can then start framing solutions targeted at those groups and their experiences. Because remember, in that world, people's experiences is what counts. And if we want to change their behavior, we need to start from their experiences. How we frame problems. We can start framing problems based on their worldviews and what's going on for them and the language that they use. We have an ability to communicate with these groups in their language, using the concepts and frameworks that they're actually using. So when they're talking about hot or vested interests or oil or governance or greed, we can start using that language to engage with them. We have the ability to start detecting weak or negative relationships. I didn't show you some of this, but remember I said we've got people to identify who they are, scientists, government agents, general public, but also who's in the narrative, scientists, general public, government agents. We also got them to say, how were you feeling when you told us that narrative? Strongly negative, negative, positive, neutral, strongly positive. So we can say, do scientists talk about government agents in negative or positive terms? Who's in their narrative, and are they strong, positive or negative relationships? So we can start identifying, are there weak relational links that we need to then invest in and improve? We can start understanding what motivates people and what inhibits them to take action. We can look at, are they acting, and look at those who are not acting and try and understand why the difference. What is it that's stimulating or motivating one group to act and not another? And it enables us to identify actions to try and improve adaptation outcomes. So the approach that we're using is action-oriented. It's designed to support people who've got legitimacy to act in a given arena to act to improve the situation, to use this kind of knowledge to identify actions, to intervene, and then use the same kind of data collection protocol to monitor outcome. Multiple perspectives require an openness to alternative perspectives and an openness to the new and unexpected. And again, that's quite a challenge for people. We really use our frames of reference. If you think back to the example of the Concordia, you had judged the captain go down with a ship. You've got a frame of reference that's come from the media. It's going to be very difficult for you to adopt an alternative perspective that he did the very best he could. You're locked into a frame of reference. To use a multi-perspectives approach, we need to be able to stand outside of our frames of reference and look at the world from alternative frames of reference. We need to have a willingness to suspend accepted conceptualizations. We live in a world which is framed by particular discourse, and particularly in science, there's a particular way of framing the world, whether it's resilience, or whether it's vulnerability, or whether it's risk. And each one of those comes along with it a whole cloud of concepts and baggage, if you like. We're not free to move, and we have to be able to change our frames of reference, to abandon or suspend our current models of how the world works. It's very difficult for scientists, it's very difficult for normal everyday people. One of the most important things, I think, for using this kind of approach is to recognize that knowledge is not within us, but is out there with people. If you accept that there's two kinds of knowledge, explicit knowledge, which is codified knowledge, knowledge written in books, knowledge that we learn at school, and there's tacit knowledge, which is our everyday experiential knowledge. I doubt any of us could learn how to drive a car by reading a book. You've got to go out there and do it, right? That's tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge isn't codified. It's out there in everybody's lived experience. What we're trying to capture is that knowledge and learn from that knowledge. If we go into these kind of multi-perspective situations with the expectation that we know and we are here to give you our knowledge, it's problematic. What we are doing is we're saying the knowledge is out there, can we collect it, synthesize it, and share it? How we find meaning and make sense. The worldviews, the social representations, the frames of reference we use have a very, very powerful impact on how we act. And I guess all I'm saying is we need to be aware of that and take due cognizance of those framing, the way we frame the world, the worldviews that are around us, because they impact how we act. Thank you.
Thank you.